The marketplace of Stellar's Edge buzzed with life, a chaos that bordered on cacophony. Under the shadow of massive rust-streaked hangars, traders hawked wares from every corner of the galaxy. The air was thick with the mingled scents of exotic spices, burning plasma coils and sweat. Jacob Rourke pushed through the crowd, his worn boots scuffing against the grooved steel flooring, his gaze darting from stall to stall. The hum of voices, alien and human alike, battered at his ears, but he'd learned long ago to tune out the noise. He wasn't here for leisure or sightseeing. He had a mission: collect what he was owed or cut his losses, preferably the former. Jacob's face, weathered by years under alien suns and artificial lights, was a mask of quiet determination. His jacket, patched and frayed at the edges, spoke to a life of hard use. Each pocket held a tool or trinket vital to his trade. Salvaging wasn't glamorous, but it kept his ship running and his stomach half full. Most days. "Jacob, my friend, over here." A voice cut through the din, oily and ingratiating. Jacob turned toward the source, his expression hardening. Zurith, the alien merchant, stood behind a cluttered stall. His greenish skin shimmered faintly under the harsh artificial lights, and his forearms waved in an exaggerated display of welcome. His round, bulbous eyes gleamed with a mix of nervous energy and forced cheer. "Zurith," Jacob said, his tone flat. He folded his arms, his fingers tapping against the fabric of his jacket. "You owe me 3 shipments worth of hyperdrive cores. And interest. I'm not here for pleasantries." Zurith's wide, too bright grin faltered for an instant before he regained his composure. "Ah, yes. The cores. You see, Jacob, I've had a minor setback. My funds are currently, shall we say, temporarily redirected. But..." He lifted a finger, one of 4, to forestall Jacob's immediate retort. "I have brought you something far better than credits. Unless it's a cargo bay full of pristine cores, I'm not interested." Zurith chuckled nervously, his hands rubbing together. "Not quite, no. But I assure you, this will more than satisfy you. A companion for your travels, skilled, loyal, and adaptable. A perfect solution to all your woes." Jacob frowned. "A companion?" Zurith gestured, and a figure stepped out from the shadows of the stall. A woman, alien, undeniably striking, emerged into the light. Her skin was a deep, otherworldly purple, gleaming with a subtle sheen like polished amethyst. Her eyes, an intense shade of violet, seemed almost too large for her face, their depth unsettling. A cascade of dark hair fell over her shoulders, though her attire was simple, bordering on tattered, a stark contrast to her dignified bearing. "This is Liara," Zurith announced, his voice dripping with theatricality. "She will prove indispensable to you." Liara's gaze locked onto Jacob's, steady and unflinching. Despite her circumstances, she carried herself with an air of quiet defiance, as if daring him to dismiss her outright. She said nothing, her expression calm but inscrutable. Jacob stared at Zurith. "You're offering me a person?" No. Not a person, not in that sense." Zurith raised all 4 of his hands defensively. "A companion. A maid, if you will. Someone to ease your burdens, keep your ship running smoothly. She is more than capable, I assure you." Liara finally spoke, her voice low and measured. "I am here of my own choice. If you do not wish to accept me, I will find another way." Her words were calm, but there was something in her tone, pride perhaps, or resignation, that struck Jacob. He studied her for a long moment, trying to reconcile the contradictions she presented. Everything about her, from her posture to her gaze, suggested someone accustomed to respect, not servitude. "This is insane," Jacob muttered, running a hand through his dark, graying hair. "I'm not some slaver." Zurith's grin reappeared, wider and slicker than before. "No slavery involved. Consider it a partnership. She gains shelter, safety, and purpose. You gain a skilled assistant. Everyone wins." Jacob hesitated. The idea felt wrong on a level he couldn't articulate, but desperation weighed heavy on his shoulders. His ship, the Iron Horizon, was barely holding together. Every haul seemed to yield less profit, and the galaxy had little mercy for those on the losing end of fortune. He needed help, and whether he liked it or not, this was an offer he couldn't easily dismiss. "You're sure this is what you want?" he asked Liara, his voice quieter now. Her chin lifted slightly, her violet eyes unwavering. "Yes." Jacob sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Fine. But if this goes sideways, Zurith, you'll regret it." Zurith clapped his hands, all 4 of them. "A pleasure doing business, as always. I knew you were a man of reason." Back aboard the Iron Horizon, Jacob showed Liara to the engine room, a cramped, grimy space where exposed wires and patched panels told the story of countless near misses and hasty repairs. "This is your bunk," Jacob said, pointing to a narrow cot tucked into the corner. "It's not much, but it's yours. We leave early, so get some rest." Liara inspected the space without complaint. Her fingers brushed against the wall, tracing a seam where the metal plating had been unevenly welded. "You did this yourself?" she asked. Jacob shrugged. "Someone had to." "You're resourceful," she said, her tone neutral. He frowned. "You're here to work, not to analyze me." Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "As you say." Jacob left her to settle in, retreating to the cockpit. As he stared out at the endless expanse of stars, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he'd just invited trouble aboard his ship. Liara's calm demeanor, her strange composure, it didn't fit. And then there was her skin, that deep, luminous purple. He'd seen hundreds of species in his time, but none quite like her. She wasn't just some maid, he could feel it. For now, though, he couldn't afford to ask too many questions. The debts piling up around him left little room for curiosity. But as he closed his eyes and tried to rest, one thought lingered in his mind. Who was Liara, and what had she really traded to end up here? The engine room of the Iron Horizon hummed softly as Jacob Rourke tinkered with a stripped-down stabilizer coil. The room smelled of burnt metal and lubricating oil, scents he'd grown so accustomed to they barely registered anymore. Sweat dotted his brow as he worked, his fingers deftly twisting wires and tightening bolts. This stabilizer had to work. Without it, the next hyperspace jump could turn into their last. A voice broke the silence, that wires grounding against the casing. Jacob jerked his head up, startled. Liara stood a few feet away, her arms crossed. Her dark hair fell in a neat cascade over her shoulders, framing her luminous purple skin. She looked calm, but her sharp eyes flicked to the coil he was working on. "I know what I'm doing," Jacob said, his voice defensive. Her lips quirked upward in the faintest smirk. "If you did, your ship wouldn't have stalled during our last jump." Jacob scowled. "It was a temporary fault." "It was avoidable," Liara replied, stepping closer. She crouched beside him, examining the coil. "That insulation won't hold if you plan to push the reactor to full capacity." Jacob watched as she pointed to the offending wire, her movements precise and deliberate. He wanted to argue, to brush her off, but she was right. Muttering under his breath, he reached for a spool of reinforced conduit. Liara didn't gloat or push further, which was almost worse. She simply rose and turned back to the control panel she'd been calibrating. "You always this helpful?" Jacob asked, not bothering to hide the edge in his tone. "I'm efficient," she replied without looking at him. "If I see something broken, I fix it." Jacob narrowed his eyes. "And how does someone like you, someone Zurith called a maid, know so much about starship mechanics?" Liara paused, her hand stilling for the briefest moment. "I learned quickly." "That's not an answer." Her gaze met his, cool and steady. "Maybe it's the only one you'll get." Jacob's gut twisted with suspicion, but he didn't press further. Not yet. Instead, he turned his focus back to the stabilizer coil, but his thoughts kept circling back to Liara. Everything about her felt out of place, from her flawless poise to the way she carried herself aboard his haphazard ship. Later that evening, Jacob sat in the cockpit, flipping through the small haul of salvage goods he'd picked up at Stellar's Edge. It wasn't much, just a few circuit boards and a damaged holo projector, but it might fetch enough credits to keep the Iron Horizon running a little longer. He turned over a small metal disc that had been buried in the pile. It was smooth and unmarked, no bigger than the palm of his hand. He tapped its surface, and the disc flickered to life, projecting a swirling hologram of alien symbols. Jacob frowned, holding it up to the light. It wasn't part of any standard tech he'd encountered before. As he examined it, footsteps echoed behind him. He glanced over his shoulder to see Liara lingering in the doorway. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice gruff. She tilted her head, her violet eyes locking onto the hologram. "Where did you get that?" Jacob hesitated. "Found it in the salvage. Why?" Liara stepped closer, her expression tightening. "You shouldn't have this." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Why not? It's just a piece of junk." "It's not junk," she said, her tone sharper now. "It's a data key. And if you're not careful, it could get us both killed." Jacob leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. Care to explain? She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze darted between him and the disk, calculating. Finally, she sighed and reached for the data key. Jacob didn't stop her. She placed it on the console and activated it with a precise sequence of taps. The swirling symbols sharpened, morphing into a map, a three-dimensional chart of stars and planets. Jacob whistled low. Looks like a nav chart. What's so dangerous about that? It's not the chart itself, Liara said, her voice quieter now. It's what it leads to. Her fingers danced across the console, zooming in on a single point in the galaxy. The projection shifted, revealing an image of a grand structure, gleaming towers rising from the surface of a verdant planet, their designs intricate and otherworldly. Jacob stared. What is that? My home, Liara said. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jacob looked at her, his mind racing. She had never volunteered information about herself before. Now, with this single revelation, the pieces of her puzzle began to fall into place. You're not a maid, Jacob said flatly. No, she admitted. Zurith lied to you. He traded me because he owed debts far more dangerous than yours. I'm the last of the Vryson dynasty, the rightful heir to what you see here. Jacob's grip tightened on the edge of the console. And why would a dynasty heiress end up as someone else's bargaining chip? Because my uncle betrayed my family, Liara said, her voice cold. He staged a coup, murdered anyone loyal to me, and claimed the throne for himself. Zurith smuggled me out before I could join the others in death, but he sold me out the moment survival demanded it. Jacob shook his head. And now you're here, with me. Zurith thought I was useless, she said. But I'm not. I've spent years running, learning, surviving. And now thanks to you I have this. She gestured to the data key, the coordinates to my family stronghold. Jacob leaned back, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had 1,000 questions, but only one mattered right now. What do you expect me to do with all this? Liara met his gaze, her violet eyes burning with quiet intensity. You're a salvager. You take things others abandon and make them work again. I need you to help me take back what was stolen. He scoffed. You think I'm some kind of hero? I'm barely keeping my ship afloat. You're resourceful, she said, echoing her words from earlier. And you're not the kind of man who turns his back on someone in need. Whether you like it or not, you're already involved. Jacob exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to argue, to deny everything she'd said. But the truth was already sinking in. This wasn't just about her. If Liara was telling the truth, the stakes were far bigger than he'd bargained for. Fine, he said finally. But if we're doing this, you'd better be as useful as you say you are. Her lips curved into a small, determined smile. You won't regret it. Jacob wasn't so sure, but one thing was certain: his life had just gotten a hell of a lot more complicated. The iron horizon glided through the void of space, its engines humming with a reassuring constancy. Jacob Rourke sat at the helm, his hands light on the controls. The cockpit, though cramped and cluttered, was his sanctuary, a space where he had total command, even if his ship was a patchwork of outdated tech and salvaged parts. The quiet was deceiving. Jacob had been in space long enough to know that stillness often preceded trouble. His eyes flicked to the console, scanning the systems. For now, everything seemed normal, but his gut told him otherwise. Years of living on the edge of solvency and safety had honed his instincts. He turned to the sensor array, just to be sure. Find what you're looking for. Liara's voice broke the silence. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her violet eyes steady on him. Her purple skin seemed to catch the dim cockpit light, giving her an ethereal glow. Nothing yet, Jacob replied, leaning back in his chair. But something doesn't feel right. Her gaze moved to the console, then to the viewport where stars stretched infinitely. Your instincts are sharp. Jacob chuckled dryly. Sharp doesn't pay the bills. Sometimes it saves your life. Before Jacob could respond, the ship's alarm let out a sharp staccato beep. His attention snapped to the screen, where a faint energy signature appeared, closing in from behind. What the Jacob muttered, adjusting the controls. He tapped the monitor to sharpen the signal. A second later, the reading stabilized, revealing a small, fast-moving ship on their tail. Lyra stepped closer, her expression unreadable. Bounty hunters. Jacob's jaw tightened. You sound sure. They've been following us since Stellar's Edge, she said, pointing to the monitor. Their pilot's clever. They've stayed just outside the range of your sensors until now. Jacob swore under his breath. He keyed the intercom and brought the rest of the ship to alert. "What's the protocol for having a target on your back?" he asked, half sarcastic. "Survive," Lyra said simply. The console lit up as the pursuing ship sent a transmission. Jacob hesitated for a moment before opening the channel. A voice, deep and mechanical, crackled through the speakers. "Iron Horizon, this is Captain Tashan of the Black Crescent. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will be met with force." Jacob's grip on the controls tightened. Friendly type. "They're not bluffing," Liara said. "Tashan has a reputation for taking what he wants. He doesn't negotiate." Jacob scoffed. "Let's see if we can change that." He keyed the transmitter. "Tashan, this is Captain Rourke. You've made a mistake. I don't have anything worth taking, and my cargo's worthless scrap." The voice came back, colder this time. "Your cargo includes Liara Vrissen. That makes you worth my time." Jacob shot a look at Liara, who remained stone-faced. "Care to explain how they know your name?" "They've likely been watching since the market," she said. Zurith wasn't careful. Jacob gritted his teeth. "Fantastic." The Black Crescent was gaining its sleek, predatory design, a stark contrast to the Iron Horizon's rugged utilitarianism. Jacob swore again and adjusted the ship's trajectory, heading for a nearby asteroid field. "Are you seriously going in there?" Liara asked, a note of concern in her voice. "Got a better idea?" She didn't respond, which Jacob took as a no. He pushed the throttle, sending the Horizon hurtling toward the tumbling expanse of rock and debris. The asteroid field loomed ahead, its jagged boulders spinning in chaotic orbits. "This ship's not built for this kind of maneuvering," Liara warned. Jacob smirked, though his knuckles were white on the controls. "Then hold on tight." The Iron Horizon plunged into the field, dodging massive chunks of rock that spun perilously close. Alarms blared as the ship's proximity sensors struggled to keep up. Jacob's focus sharpened, his movements precise as he guided the ship through the deadly maze. Behind them, the Black Crescent hesitated for a moment before following, its more agile frame allowing it to close the gap. "They're gaining," Liara said. "I noticed," Jacob replied, his voice taut. "What, do you have anything that can slow them down?" she asked, glancing at the weapons panel. Jacob shook his head. "Nothing that'll scratch a ship like that." Liara's eyes scanned the cockpit, her mind racing. Then she spotted a small control on the side panel. "What about the flares?" Jacob blinked. "They're for emergencies, not." "Use them," she interrupted. With a grimace, Jacob flipped the switch. The ship released a burst of bright, glowing flares, scattering them into the asteroid field. The sudden light confused the Black Crescent's targeting systems, forcing it to slow as its pilot recalibrated. "Buys us a minute tops," Jacob said. Liara's gaze shifted to the cargo-based schematics on the screen. "What about the reactor-grade fuel cells?" Jacob shot her a look. "You want to use that? If we jettison one and detonate it, the explosion will create enough debris to block their path," she said. "That's suicidal." "It's better than being caught." Jacob hesitated for only a second. He knew she was right. With a grim nod, he adjusted the ship's course and activated the cargo controls. A single container detached from the bay, drifting behind them. He armed the rear cannon and took aim. "Hope you're as good as you say you are," he muttered. "Fire," Liara said. Jacob squeezed the trigger. The cannon's blast struck the container, igniting the volatile fuel inside. The explosion lit up the asteroid field, sending shock waves rippling through the debris. Rocks and shrapnel careened in every direction, creating a deadly barrier. The Iron Horizon shuddered violently, but Jacob kept it steady. When the turbulence subsided, he checked the rear monitor. The Black Crescent had disappeared, swallowed by the chaos. Liara exhaled, her hands braced against the console. That worked. "Barely," Jacob said, his voice still tight. He adjusted their course, steering clear of the field. As the ship stabilized, an uneasy silence settled between them. Jacob leaned back in his chair, his muscles aching from the tension. Liara stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "You've done this before," he said finally. "What makes you think that?" Jacob looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "You don't act like someone who's running for the first time. You knew exactly what to do back there." Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line. I've had practice. That's not an answer. She met his gaze, her violet eyes steady. You're right. It's not. Jacob let out a bitter laugh. Great. Another mystery. Lyra turned away, her voice quiet but firm. Get used to it. Jacob watched her go, his mind racing. Whatever he'd gotten himself into, it was far bigger than he'd anticipated. And for better or worse, there was no turning back now. The iron horizon drifted into the shadow of the asteroid belt, its engines muted to a whisper. Jacob sat rigid in the cockpit, his eyes darting between the sensor array and the viewport. The black void beyond the ship felt oppressive, dotted with only the faint glimmer of distant stars. Every shadow could be an ambush. Every silence could mean a trap. Lyra stood behind him, her presence calm but unyielding. Her violet eyes scanned the screens with an intensity that made Jacob feel like she could see beyond them, as if she sensed danger before it materialized. Are you sure this is the place? Jacob asked, his voice low. Yes, she replied. Talos is here. He's been hiding since the coup. Jacob leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Hiding in a graveyard of rocks. Fantastic. Lyra didn't respond, but her posture stiffened slightly. Jacob had learned to pick up on these subtle shifts in her demeanor. She was good at masking her emotions, but every now and then, a crack in her composure revealed the weight she carried. Tell me about him, Jacob said, breaking the silence. This Talos, what makes you think he'll help? He was my father's most trusted commander, Lyra said. When my uncle staged the coup, Talos stayed loyal. He tried to stop the uprising, but it was too late. My uncle declared him a traitor and put a bounty on his head. Jacob frowned. Sounds like the kind of guy who wouldn't want to be found. He'll help, Lyra said firmly. He's the only one who can. Jacob studied her for a moment, then turned back to the controls. If you say so. The ship's sensors beeped softly, drawing Jacob's attention. A faint energy signature appeared on the screen, faint but steady. There, Lyra said, pointing to the blip. That's him. Jacob adjusted their course, guiding the iron horizon toward the signal. As they approached, the outline of a large asteroid came into view. Its surface was jagged and uneven, dotted with craters and fissures. Nestled in one of the larger craters was a structure, an amalgamation of salvaged ship parts and rock, camouflaged to blend with the asteroid itself. Subtle, Jacob muttered. As the ship neared the structure, a voice crackled over the comm system. Unidentified vessel, state your purpose or turn back. Lyra stepped forward. This is Lyra Vressen. I need to speak with Captain Talos. There was a long pause, and Jacob's grip on the controls tightened. Finally, the voice returned, softer but no less cautious. Lyra? Prove it. Without hesitation, Lyra pressed a sequence of buttons on the comm panel, transmitting a coded signal. Jacob recognized it as the data key she had shown him earlier, but he didn't fully understand its significance. Whatever it was, it worked. The comm crackled again, and this time, the voice was filled with something Jacob hadn't expected: relief. Docket Bay 2, the voice said, quickly. Jacob guided the iron horizon into the structure, landing with a soft jolt. The docking bay was dimly lit, its walls lined with mismatched panels and exposed wiring. As the ship's engines powered down, Jacob felt a knot of tension in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was the anticipation of meeting Talos, or the fact that they were now deep inside a place they couldn't easily escape. The airlock hissed open, and Lyra stepped out first. Jacob followed, his hand resting instinctively on the blaster at his hip. The docking bay was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of machinery. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Captain Talos was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding despite the streaks of gray in his hair and the deep lines etched into his face. His uniform, though worn and patched, bore the insignia of the Vressen dynasty. His piercing eyes locked onto Lyra, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Lyra, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You're alive. Lyra nodded, her composure wavering for the first time. Thanks to you. Talos stepped forward, clasping her hands in his. Your father would be proud. Jacob shifted uncomfortably, feeling like an intruder in the moment. Talos's gaze moved to him, sharp and assessing. And you are? Talos asked. Jacob Rourke, Jacob said, his tone neutral. captain of the Iron Horizon, Liara's transportation. Talos raised an eyebrow. Transportation. Liara interjected. Jacob has been helping me. I wouldn't have made it this far without him. Talos studied Jacob for a moment longer, then nodded. Then you have my thanks. Jacob shrugged. Let's skip the gratitude. What's the plan? Talos gestured for them to follow. He led them through a series of narrow corridors, the walls vibrating faintly with the energy of the asteroid's hidden systems. They entered a large room that appeared to be a command center. Maps and schematics covered the walls, and a small group of people, mostly humans, and a few aliens worked at various consoles. This is what's left of the Vressen resistance, Talos said, his tone grim. We've been gathering resources and intelligence, waiting for the right moment to strike. And you think that moment is now? Jacob asked. Talos glanced at Liara. With her here, we have a chance. Her presence will rally those still loyal to the dynasty. Liara straightened, her regal bearing returning. What about my uncle? He's consolidated power, Talos said. But he's made enemies. If we can expose his ties to the syndicates, we can turn the tide. Jacob frowned. You're talking about a full-scale rebellion. It's the only way, Talos said. Jacob shook his head. You're outgunned and outnumbered. Do you really think a handful of people and some scrap ships are going to take down an empire? Thalos's eyes hardened. We've survived this long because we know how to adapt. If you're not here to help, you're free to leave. Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but Liara's voice cut him off. He's right. Jacob turned to her, surprised. You're seriously considering this? Liara's gaze didn't waver. I have to. My people need me. Jacob exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. This is suicide. Maybe, she said, but it's better than running. Talos placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll need time to prepare. For now, you're safe here. Jacob didn't feel safe. He felt trapped. But as he looked at Liara, standing resolute in the face of impossible odds, he felt something else, a flicker of admiration. She wasn't just running from her past. She was running towards something greater. And despite every instinct telling him to cut his losses and leave, Jacob knew he couldn't walk away. Not yet. The dimly lit briefing room on Talos's asteroid base thrummed with tension. A holographic map of the galaxy's central trade routes hovered in the air, spinning slowly. Each line glowed faintly, a network of connections linking planets, colonies, and syndicate strongholds. Around the room, members of the Vressen resistance stood in uneasy silence, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. Jacob leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He scanned the room, noting the patched uniforms, the scars, the wary glances. This was no polished military, these were survivors. At the head of the room, Captain Talos stood beside Liara. His presence was imposing, a sharp contrast to Liara's quieter strength. The former commander gestured toward the hologram, his voice steady but commanding. We've confirmed what we feared, Talos said. The syndicate has infiltrated the inner workings of the Vressen government. They're propping up Liara's uncle, using him as a puppet to control trade routes and resources. Jacob frowned. Sounds like they're running the show. What's your plan to stop them? Talos's gaze shifted to Liara. We need evidence, something concrete that links the syndicate to the coup. Without it, we can't rally the neutral factions or gain galactic support. Liara nodded. Where do we start? Talos tapped the hologram, zooming in on a bustling trade hub. The image resolved into the outline of a massive station orbiting a gas giant. Its sleek design bristled with docking arms, cargo bays, and defensive turrets. This is Nexer Station, Talos said. It's one of the syndicate's main hubs. Ships carrying illicit cargo pass through there daily, hidden under layers of false manifests. If we can infiltrate the station's mainframe, we can extract the records. Jacob pushed off the wall. Sounds straightforward. What's the catch? The syndicate doesn't take chances, Talos replied. The station is heavily guarded, and their security systems are state-of-the-art. Getting in will require precision and stealth. Jacob rubbed his jaw. You've got someone for that. You, Talos said simply. Jacob blinked. Me? Liara stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Jacob knows how to move through the cracks. He's been doing it his whole life. And he's proven he can handle himself. Jacob let out a sharp laugh. You're giving me a lot of credit. You do realize I've never infiltrated a syndicate fortress. You've survived against impossible odds, Liara said. That's what we need. Thalos interjected, his tone brokering no argument. You won't be alone. Liara will go with you. Jacob glanced at her, incredulous. You're joking. Liara met his gaze without flinching. You'll need me to access their systems, and I'm not sitting on the sidelines while others fight my battles. Before Jacob could argue further, a wiry woman with sharp features stepped forward. She carried a satchel of tools slung over her shoulder and had the look of someone who'd seen more than her share of trouble. I'll go too, she said. Name's Karis. I know Nexar's layout like the back of my hand. If you're walking into that place, you'll want me with you. Talis nodded. Karis is one of our best operatives. She'll guide you to the mainframe. Jacob sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine, but when this goes sideways, don't say I didn't warn you. The Iron Horizon approached Nexar Station under the cover of a decoy transponder, its signature masked to appear as a merchant freighter. Jacob sat at the controls, his focus razor sharp as the station loomed ahead. Its metallic surface gleamed in the light of the gas giant, a sprawling maze of activity. Keep it steady, Karis said from the co-pilot seat. The docking protocols are automated, but any irregularities will flag us. Jacob grunted in acknowledgement, adjusting the ship's trajectory. Liara stood behind them, her gaze fixed on the station. She looked calm, but Jacob caught the slight tension in her posture. Once we're inside, Karis continued, we've got a narrow window to reach the mainframe. Security sweeps every 30 minutes. If we're still there when they come through, we're dead. No pressure, Jacob muttered. The ship docked without incident, its landing bay ceiling shut behind it. As the airlock hissed open, Jacob adjusted his jacket, feeling the weight of the concealed blaster at his hip. Liara and Karis followed him down the ramp, their movements deliberate and controlled. The docking bay was bustling with activity. Workers in jumpsuits moved cargo crates, while droids hovered between them, scanning shipments. Jacob kept his head down, blending into the flow as they made their way to a maintenance corridor. This way, Karis whispered, leading them through a series of narrow passageways. The air smelled of coolant and ozone, the hum of machinery echoing around them. After several tense minutes, they reached a small access panel. Karis knelt and pried it open, revealing a tangle of wires and circuits. She began working quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Give me a sec, she said. I'm bypassing the security lock. Jacob leaned against the wall, his eyes darting down the corridor. How secure is this place, really? Karis snorted. If you're asking how fast they'll kill us if we're caught, the answer's immediately. Comforting. The panel beeped, and the door slid open. Karis stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. Beyond the door was a dimly lit room filled with server racks, their lights blinking in rhythmic patterns. Liara moved to the main console, her movements confident. This will take a minute. Jacob positioned himself by the door, his hand resting on his blaster. You've got one. As Liara worked, Karis kept an eye on the security feed. Her expression darkened. We've got company. Security teams headed this way. Jacob swore under his breath. How much time? 2 minutes, maybe less. Liara, hurry up, Jacob said. I'm almost there, she replied, her fingers flying over the console. The tension in the room was palpable. Jacob's heart pounded as footsteps echoed down the corridor. He glanced at Karis, who was already drawing her weapon. The console beeped, and Liara straightened. I've got it. Let's move. They bolted from the room, retracing their steps through the maintenance corridors. The sound of alarms filled the air, the station's defenses coming to life. This way, Karis shouted, leading them toward an emergency exit. They burst into the docking bay, where workers scrambled to respond to the commotion. Jacob sprinted up the Iron Horizon's ramp, slamming his hand on the controls to seal the airlock. Get us out of here, he yelled. Liara and Karis barely made it aboard before the ship lurched upward, its engines roaring. Jacob pushed the throttle, sending the Horizon into a steep ascent. The station's defenses fired, streaks of plasma lighting up the viewport. Hold on, Jacob shouted, weaving the ship through the incoming fire. The Horizon shuddered violently, but it held together as they broke free of the station's gravity. As they sped into open space, Liara slumped into a chair, clutching the stolen data. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "We've got what we need," she said. Jacob glanced at her, his expression a mix of exasperation and admiration. "Let's hope it's worth it." "It will be," she said, her voice steady. "It has to be." The Vryson stronghold loomed ahead, its silhouette a jagged fortress perched atop the cliffs of an uncharted world. The twin moons cast silvery light across its spires, their gleam muted by the oppressive darkness of the surrounding jungle. Jacob Rourke stood at the Iron Horizon's viewport, his jaw set as he took in the sight. He'd seen fortresses before, pirate bases, corporate compounds, but this one radiated menace. It wasn't just a seat of power, it was a monument to fear. Behind him, Liara adjusted the straps of her tactical gear. Gone was the tattered traveler's garb she had worn when they met. She looked every inch the Vryson heir now, her bearing regal, her violet eyes filled with determination. Jacob had seen that look before, the quiet resolve of someone who knew they were walking into the lion's den. "You ready for this?" Jacob asked, not looking away from the viewport. "I don't have a choice," Liara replied. "This is the only way to end it." Jacob turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You're not just walking into your uncle's stronghold. You're walking into a trap." "I know," Liara said, "but he won't expect me to have allies." Carice entered the cockpit, her sharp features softened by the dim light. "We've got one shot at this," she said. "If we fail, it's not just us who die. The resistance crumbles, and the Syndicate keeps its stranglehold on the galaxy." Jacob exhaled heavily. No pressure. The plan was as audacious as it was dangerous. Using the stolen data from Nexer Station, the Resistance had pinpointed the stronghold's weaknesses. Talos and his fleet would launch a diversionary assault, drawing the bulk of the defenders away. Meanwhile, Jacob, Liara, and Karis would infiltrate the fortress and confront her uncle directly. The goal wasn't just to take him down, it was to expose his alliance with the Syndicate to the galaxy. As the Iron Horizon descended through the jungle canopy, the sounds of distant explosions echoed across the landscape. Talos's fleet had begun their attack, the sky lit by the fiery trails of missiles and the sharp flashes of laser fire. Jacob guided the ship to a concealed landing zone, his movements precise despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The ramp lowered with a hiss, and the team disembarked, their boots sinking into the damp soil. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of vegetation mingling with the faint tang of burning metal from the battle overhead. The jungle teemed with life, the calls of alien creatures punctuating the distant rumble of artillery. "This way," Karis said, leading them through the dense foliage. She moved like a shadow, her steps silent despite the uneven terrain. Liara followed close behind, her blaster held steady. Jacob brought up the rear, his eyes scanning for movement. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle a potential threat. He hated the jungle, it offered too many places for danger to hide. They reached the fortress's outer wall without incident. The structure was massive, its surface smooth and dark, broken only by narrow slits that served as windows. Karis pulled out a compact device, attaching it to the wall near a concealed access hatch. The device emitted a soft hum as it worked, bypassing the security protocols. 5 seconds, Karis whispered. Jacob's grip on his blaster tightened as the hatch slid open. They slipped inside, moving through narrow corridors illuminated by dim, flickering lights. The air inside was cold, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the jungle. The hum of machinery reverberated through the walls, a constant reminder of the fortress's function as both a command center and a prison. They encountered their first patrol just past the armory. 2 guards clad in dark armor rounded the corner. Before they could react, Karis dropped the first with a silenced shot, while Liara dispatched the second with a swift, calculated strike. Jacob stared at her, impressed despite himself. "You've been holding out on me." Liara didn't respond, her focus already on the path ahead. They reached the main control room without further incident. The room was cavernous, dominated by a massive holomup of the galaxy. Dozens of monitors displayed live feeds from across the stronghold, each one showing the chaos of Talos's diversionary assault. At the center of the room stood Lord Kael Vresson, Liara's uncle. His imposing figure was framed by the flickering glow of the holomup. His silver hair gleamed under the harsh lights, his dark robes flowing around him like a shadow. His eyes, the same striking violet as Liara's, were cold and calculating. "You've finally come," Kael said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I wondered how long you'd run before you realized the futility of it." "I'm not running anymore," Liara said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, but Jacob could hear the undercurrent of emotion beneath it. This ends tonight. Kale smiled, a predator's grin. You think you can challenge me? You're a child playing at rebellion. You have no idea how deep this goes. I know enough, Liara said. I know you sold our family to the syndicate. I know you're nothing but their puppet. Kyle's expression darkened. Careful, niece. You don't understand the sacrifices I've made to protect our dynasty. Protect. Lyra's voice rose, her composure cracking. You murdered our family. You destroyed everything we stood for. Don't you dare call it protection. Jacob shifted his stance, his blaster aimed at Kale. He knew this confrontation was personal, but the tension in the room felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Kale's hand moved subtly, activating a hidden control on his throne. A pair of automated turrets descended from the ceiling, their barrels whirring as they locked onto the intruders. Drop your weapons, Kale commanded. Jacob didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot, destroying one turret before diving for cover. Karis took out the second with a precise blast, the turret exploding in a shower of sparks. Chaos erupted. Kale lunged toward a console, but Liara was faster. She tackled him, the two grappling as the holomup flickered around them. Jacob and Karis covered the entrances, fending off guards who swarmed into the room. Liara and Kale struggled, their movements a blur. He was stronger, but she was quicker, her strikes fueled by years of anger and grief. Finally, she wrenched his weapon from him, leveling it at his chest. It's over, she said, her voice trembling. Kale laughed, blood staining his teeth. You think killing me will fix this? The syndicate will crush you. You've already lost. Liara hesitated, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jacob stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. He's stalling. Take the evidence, and let's go. Kale's laughter faded as Liara retrieved the data drive from his console. She stared at him for a moment longer, then turned away. Let's finish this, she said. They fled the control room as alarms blared, the fortress shaking under the force of Talos' assault. The Iron Horizon awaited them, its engines roaring to life as they boarded. Jacob didn't look back as they blasted into the sky, leaving the stronghold in flames. In the cockpit, Liara clutched the data drive, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. Jacob glanced at her, his voice soft. You did it. She nodded, her violet eyes meeting his. We did. For the first time, Jacob felt something he hadn't in years hoped.